If what you wanted for Christmas was a long time listening to Bob Murphy talk on the Libertarian Christian podcast, you must have been good this year. Hope you like it, folks.
Welcome to the show that gets Christians thinking about faith and politics. Get ready to challenge the status quo, expand your imagination, and tackle controversy head on. Let's stand together at the intersection of faith and freedom. It's time for the Libertarian Christian Podcast.
Welcome to another episode of the Libertarian Christian Podcast, a project of the Libertarian Christian Institute. I'm Doug Stewart, and with me today is Nick Gosling, and we have special guest Bob Murphy with us today. Bob, he's a man that needs no introduction to this show. In addition to hearing his voice every time you listen to an episode of our podcast, you can hear him as co-host of the podcast Contra Krugman, as well as the Laura Murphy Report. Bob is the author of numerous books, and he blogs regularly at consultingbyrpm.com. And on every Sunday, what Bob does is he actually talks about something that's more along the lines of his Christian faith. He is public that he is a Christian, and he is a libertarian / anarcho-capitalist. And Bob, a lot of people look up to you as a Christian. I think a lot of Christians look up to you because they see you as an example of someone who has, in many ways, thought about the integration of your faith and your anarcho-capitalism / libertarianism. I'm probably not going to need to say that all show. You know, a lot of people look up to you, and we wanted to have you on the show to talk about your Christian testimony and just give us a little bit of background on your thinking on how does your faith and your philosophy of liberty go together. So thanks for being here.
Well, thanks for having me, guys. And not only do I not need an introduction, I am the introduction to this show, or at least I have been for a while.
That's a really good point.
I appreciate the kind remarks. I should probably say at the outset, it actually makes me uncomfortable if you say Christians look up to me because, you know, of course, there's no such thing as a good Christian or an adequate Christian except Jesus himself. And so let me just say that obvious disclaimer. But yeah, certainly I'm happy to talk about my background and, you know, how did I get to be where I am at this point, because it is somewhat of an unusual story probably. And let me also just say that I think the role that I'm playing, or one of the roles in this, is that it was not that long ago where I really very with trepidation started blogging about my faith because I was expecting to get just waves of protest. And actually that did happen in the beginning. And then it kind of died down. Like, I think people just realized, okay, this guy's hopeless. You know, he believes in this magical fairy in the sky, and, you know, we thought he was reasonable, and they moved on. And then I got a lot of emails over time from people saying, yeah, I've been a libertarian for a long time, but I've been a lifelong Christian, and I just kept my mouth shut because on social media, like the atheist, the militant atheist libertarians are just so dominant, and so we're glad you're speaking out. So that was the perception, but I don't know if it's just a thing of now that I'm looking for it, I notice it, or what the changes. But I don't sense that anymore. I think there's that people who are religious and libertarian don't feel like, you know, they got to keep that to themselves now, that there's enough of us that are. And of course, what you guys are doing, I mean, that's a pretty big example of what I'm talking about. So anyway, I just want to say for people who are new to this, the climate has changed for whatever reason, that it used to be that, yeah, you really were asking to just get attacked by people, putting a bullseye on yourself online, and that seems to have gotten a lot better.
Yeah, that's something. You're right. The climate has changed in that regard, and I hope LCI has contributed to that in a positive way. I mean, we have a large Facebook group, but and a lot of people are able to ask questions of each other and how, you know, examples and stuff. So yeah, but so were you, Bob, tell us, I guess way to start this would be to ask you to just give us a little bit of your backstory. I don't know if you grew up a Christian, if you could just share with us how you became a Christian. Did that come before or after being libertarian? Where does that start?
Sure. Well, my full name is, I'm Robert Patrick Murphy. I'm a good Irishman. So I was raised Catholic. So my parents are both Catholic. They, you know, if I visit them, we go to the Catholic Mass. And so I went to Catholic school K through 8. Then I went to Thomas Aquinas High School, which is Catholic if the name didn't tip you off. So I was raised Catholic. I went up through, received up through the sacrament of confirmation and that. But as I was, what happened, and I eventually became an atheist by the time I was an undergrad. And so what happened was, I'm just telling what happened to me personally. I don't, I can't speak to other people's experiences, but some of the cliche about, Catholics not reading the Bible, that was true in my case, that it, I don't know if this is typical or what, but I just know in my experience, like I was trying to read it on my own a couple times. I loved, the gospel accounts, but I started trying to read the Old Testament. I'm saying like when I was a kid, and I would just, whoa, there's some crazy stuff in there. And man, that guy of the Old Testament, man, he's mean. You don't mess around with that guy. Jesus is nice. I get Jesus. I don't get that. So that was where I was coming from. And in terms of how did I become an atheist or why, I was very much into science and reason. And I think, to be honest, nobody ever said this out loud, but looking back, I think especially the younger priests, it was a very, I don't want to say progressive. Let's just say liberal. That's a better term for the politics of the 1980s when I would have been going to these schools in the early 90s. The priests were very much into social justice, that sort of thing. And I think I literally took a class called social justice, to be honest with you. So don't tell Tom Woods that. And I was becoming, at first thought I was conservative politically, then I realized I was libertarian, and I was really into science. Like I said, I loved reading like Richard Feynman and reading stuff about relativity and all that. Before I went into economics, I actually thought I was going to be a physicist, and so I just started thinking, oh yeah, this stuff is all superstition. And also the other thing, what I meant to say about the priests that I was around, I think a lot of them just, viewed the devil as a metaphor. I think, what they viewed their role is to make people be good people on earth. And, and that was really the role of the church. I'm brushing with broad strokes, obviously, but I really, that's kind of what you'd go to, of course, at a Catholic mass, they would read from the Bible, both the Old and New Testament, but what they called the homily, the sermon was typically the places that I went. It was, the priest, trying to get you to go be better people out there. But that's fine as far as it goes, but it was not, and it could be loosely based on whatever the gospel reading was for that week, but it was not like walking through and, okay, let's look at verse 4 here. Now, what does this mean? And certainly it wasn't going through the epistles and talking about justification, obviously. So that's where so I'll stop and let you guys react to that, because I don't want to, I've been rambling for a while here, but that's where I was as of undergrad. And just to show you how serious it was, my atheism, I joked and called myself a devout atheist. I thought that was clever. And of course, what I meant by that was, like, it wasn't just, oh yeah, you know what, I don't really believe. Like, I really thought, like, I have well-developed arguments and I can sit here and have a conversation and debate you and tell you why I don't believe. I was friends with some kids who were, had been raised as strong Christians, and I was trying to talk them out of it. I wasn't doing it to be a jerk. I thought I would be freeing them. Like, I thought that they had this crazy superstition that their parents shackled them with, and I was trying to free them from it. And I actually went and got books out of the library, like George Smith's book on atheism, and Thomas Paine's The Age of Reason, and H.L. Mencken's treatise on the gods, that were all, so Paine was a deist, as I recall, but he was, had a scathing critique of the Christian Bible, like pointing out inconsistencies and things in his mind. How
did your friends take it? Were you pretty good at challenging their faith?
Yeah. I mean, they didn't abandon it, thank goodness, but so like I said, I was very nice about it. Like, it wasn't like hostile or anything. And they were, I would say stuff like, come on, if the reason you believe the particular, sect you are is because that's what your parents were. If you had been born to Muslim parents, you'd be a Muslim. And, one guy was like, yeah, maybe. Yeah, I can't say you're wrong. And ultimately, a bunch of them kind of just said, well, I've had these personal experience. Like, I felt God move in my life. And so, yeah, I can see, Bob, why, you're using these arguments, but ultimately that's going to bounce off me because, I have these direct personal interactions, and that's not going to change your logical critique of, certain inconsistencies you see in the Bible. So it was that kind of thing. But just to finish that train of thought, so I had planned on writing the definitive refutation of Christianity. So that's how serious like I said, it was. And so the fact that, people who knew me in college, when they later heard that I became a Christian, they were just astonished because, that was not at all the image I was exuding at the time.
So what was it? Was it one of those, like, in your process of refuting Christianity, you decided to embrace it, or was it something different?
That's what, like Lee Strobel, I got the right guy, am I thinking of? That was his deal. It wasn't, it would be cool if that's what it was, but no, it wasn't that. What happened, I'll try to say this as succinctly as possible without leaving out anything important. So what happened is, when I was in grad school, it was overwhelming, just the workload and everything, and I wasn't used to having to work that hard. Before I was kind of guy in undergrad, study the night before and get 100 on the test kind of thing. And so grad school at NYU, that was a huge jump, and for the first time, I was not obviously the best person. Later I got my bearings and stuff, but in the beginning I was really overwhelmed, and there were other people in my program who had masters and they had seen this kind of math before. And so anyway, it was just I was out of my comfort zone, and all the people there, well, most of them were from other countries, and so just I didn't feel like I fit in as well. And so just on a personal level, like I became really depressed. I didn't go see anybody about it or anything, but I would have been diagnosed with severe clinical depression, I'm sure, if I had gone and talked to somebody and told them, my symptoms or what have you. And then it was, I had this realization at one point that, like, I had just been for years been misinterpreting a lot of social interactions I had with people, like people that I thought didn't like me. And I was wondering, like, what I do wrong, and all these interactions would go a certain way, and I'd always walked away thinking, oh wow, that person didn't like me, or this reason, or oh wow, she must have been looking at a pimple on my forehead, or so, things like that. Just and I realized looking back that, oh wow, no, in each of these situations, the person had been intimidated by me, or me trying to fit in. Maybe I cracked a joke and hurt the person's feelings, so it's not worth trying to get in right now for the purpose of this show. But it was an epiphany. There's no other word to describe it, where I just literally saw in my mind's eye dozens of let's say at least a dozen, put it that way, of interactions, like some going years back, where I realized I had totally misinterpreted what had happened, and like it changed the narrative of my life. Like I realized, like I had been building this narrative in my head of that, people don't get me, and I'm sitting here trying to help everyone, and they're a bunch of idiots, and I was just real mad and just stereotypical angry young man kind of thing. And I realized just how much I was not always the good guy in all these interactions. Let's put it that way. So it's not that I realized I was a monster, but I realized, oh geez, that I was kidding when I said that, but I can see why that guy who didn't know me at the time thought I was really tearing into him, and oh gee. So I went through this epiphany. Like I said, it hit me, and I literally just felt the relief just wash right through me. And I had, just to give you an example of how serious, because otherwise the story doesn't make sense. It was so serious and intense that I was so stressed out and had such anxiety that, like, the skin on my face was peeling off. And I don't mean for people like understand what do I mean. It didn't look like I had a huge bad sunburn, but it was like where the nose connects to your cheek, if you will, like that area, like it was always just really raw and red. And I was seeing dermatologists and stuff, and they were giving me, it wasn't working. And when this relief just washed through me, because I realized why, I was butting my head up against the wall socially, like how I was causing my own problems, and I was not nearly the aggrieved victim that I thought, and I was causing a lot of the problems. When that relief washed through me, I instantly knew that my skin was going to be fine. Like, I had become such an expert at managing the depression and the anxiety and stress that when it was gone, I was like, oh yeah, this is what it feels like when you're normal. Like, I forgot that. And so I realized, oh yeah, the reason my skin had been flaking off is because I was so stressed out and I forgot. So like I said, I immediately had this craving and I went to a bodega and just got like a half gallon of orange juice and just chugged it. And like, so my body all of a sudden started craving things like, nutrients and whatever. And I was right. My skin was fine. And so because of that, I really understood what people meant by the power of the mind over the body and the power of suggestion and stuff like that. Because I wouldn't have believed that until I directly experienced it, that because I had faulty ideas in my head about my self-worth or whatever you want to call it, once that fixed itself, like my body just healed. And so then I was like, oh, wow, okay, now I see how that works. You know what? Instead of me thinking this guy Jesus was a complete myth that a bunch of crazy people or liars invented to try to foist this religious system on the world, which kind of doesn't make sense. Like, what, how did that gain traction if they just made it all up? My new hypothesis was, okay, I bet you there was this crazy guy 2,000 years ago who honestly believed he was the Messiah, and he was walking around healing people like with leprosy, which is what I had times 1,000. And since they believed him when he said your sins are forgiven and I'm healing you, their body fixed itself. So it wasn't. So at the time I was like coming up with rational explanations that I thought were a more plausible theory or hypothesis to explain the observations, because clearly Christianity started from nothing and took over the most of the world, and so it was just all based on a falsehood that didn't seem plausible. So I thought I came up with a scientific, rational explanation that I could believe in now because I saw firsthand the power of if you really think you're over something, your body can is pretty capable. You don't need doctors to give you something. So it was that, and then from there, it just kept accumulating, and I had some more direct. I'll tell you one last thing, and then I'll stop and let you guys respond if you want. The other huge thing, I'm condensing and skipping some steps, but so I was in that state for several days at least, of where I believed that Jesus really was going around healing people, but it was all rational and so on. And I was even coming up with stuff like the plagues, the order of them. I realized, well, wait a minute. Suppose there was something in the water that made it, messed it up, and it looked red, like it was some chemical or something, or some algae growth, or I don't know what. So it looked blood red. It wasn't actually blood, but it looked, someone looking at it would just say, wow, that is blood red. What would happen? Well, clearly all the frogs that were in, the river would jump out. And then the frogs are overrunning you, and they're going to bring flies with them. And you see what I'm saying? So I was coming up with ways of saying if there was just some initial thing to get that going, I could kind of, quote, rationally explain the 10 plagues, or not all 10 of them, but a bunch of them. Like the order kind of made sense in that thing. So that's what I was doing. And but then there were some things that went on, and I was pushed up to the point where I was realizing, okay, this is kind of silly, Bob. You're sort of grasping at straws to, you refuse to believe. Like, isn't it just simpler? Or in other words, okay, I still haven't explained, though, how did this guy Moses know that stuff was going to happen in that order, right? Even if I could explain it ex post, it still seems, if you believe the story, this guy was predicting it ahead of time, each one of them. And so that seems kind of crazy. And the same thing with Jesus. It wasn't just that, even if I could come up with a way that he could have healed people, and maybe he was nailed to a cross and he was such, he was in such good shape and had such good, stamina, and he was such an amazing person. Maybe he could be in there for 3 days or, come out, but still he predicted it, that kind of thing. So I was really, and finally I said, all right, if I see one more thing, and this is going to sound silly to people, but I have no reason to lie. I'll be honest what it was. I said I had a lot of stuff building up, and I was really on the edge of, oh my gosh, is there really a God? And I kind of just said out loud, I don't know if I actually said it out loud or just thought it, but I was like, okay, if I see one more thing, then I'll believe. And I put my hands in my pockets, and there was a $10 bill in there. Now I know that's not a big deal, but at the time, like, there was no reason there should have been a $10 bill in my pocket. And I know that might sound weird to some people and stupid, but if you knew me at the time, it was inconceivable that I would have money in my pocket and not know about it. Just that I was that anal and checking my wallet every 2 seconds. So I was like, whoa. And it was funny because I was kind of like, oh, come on, is this a joke? In other words, it wasn't like a burning bush or something, but I had just said, okay, if I see one more sign, that I'm not, that I shouldn't expect. And so then, it kind of hit me. And so this is the part. So I felt this immense guilt, because I was remembering all this stuff of the, kids in college that I was trying to talk out of it and whatever. But I felt like, hey, it was an honest mistake. Like and so I just said out loud, I am so sorry. And I heard a voice in my head saying, I forgive you. And so, believe me, I said, I would spend years, I was getting ready to write a refutation of Christianity. So I know skeptics hearing me say that are going to say, oh, come on, you felt really guilty. You wouldn't have been able to live with yourself. So your subconscious generated this voice that you quote heard so you could, get on with your life and deal with it. Yeah, I get that, but I'm telling you what I experienced. I heard a voice in my head say, I forgive you. So, so all right, I've been talking for a while. I'll stop there.
Well, that's a really powerful story, and I feel very unable to actually follow up with some questions. Thank you for sharing that. That's pretty personal, and I don't know how often you get to share that with people that your church or other family and stuff. But thanks for sharing that. Nick, do you have any questions or follow up?
So yeah, Bob, that's really just a fascinating and very personal touch, and it seems like when speaking to people who are intellectually minded, and of course there's a lot of, as we know, there are many Christians who are intellectual types, and as you've experienced and many of us have experienced, when speaking to skeptics, it's kind of like they don't get it. They don't understand how you can be so educated and quote unquote logical on some things, and yet, according to them and their perception, be totally irrational in this other area. But that's something I just think of the paradox of faith. Like if you look back to the ancient West, Greco-Roman world, where really the philosophers came out of, and everything is sort of in this very logical procession, and that's why the ancient philosophers, the Socratics and so forth, were accused of denying the gods of Greece, precisely because they reasoned everything through in this way. But the Bible predominantly is an ancient Near Eastern book, and the ancient Near Eastern world is able to hold things in paradox, and that's normal. That's part of their worldview, and I think we've kind of lost that in the modern West. I mean, there is an enigma to the faith that, while not illogical, doesn't always make evident sense to the human eye. And I think that's kind of how many of us have walked down that road. And when I hear your story, that's kind of how I think of it. So I mean, you're an educated person, a rational person, and yet this happens to you, and it just totally overpowers what you formerly thought was the logical way of looking at things. But once you realize, oh, hey, there's so many things in this world that I don't know and don't understand, that sort of challenges the paradigm. Does that kind of fit with where you're coming from?
Yeah, for sure. And let me just emphasize, I think sometimes when cynics hear my story, they misinterpret what I said, and they think I said, oh, I was really, really depressed, and then I found God, and then I wasn't depressed anymore. And so they think like, oh, you needed to invent something to get out of your depression. And so let me be clear, that is not the order of what happened. In my mind, I solved my depression on my own just by thinking it through and realizing, oh, wow, my timeline, the way I had chronicled those events from my past, actually I realized was wrong, in this narrative I had developed over years about what kind of person I was and blah, blah, and that was wrong. So, but it was because of that realization and then the relief it generated and the changes in my body that's when I said, oh, wow, the ability of your mind to affect your body is stronger than I would have thought until seeing that. So anyway, just want to put that down. But yeah, you're right. And there's been a few times in my life where I have been really sure I understood something. I mean, I'm not talking about secular things. This had nothing to do with faith or, faith versus science, that kind of thing. And I realized I was wrong later, and you could use the cliche of a paradigm shift. Just things like from economics, it was Arrow's impossibility theorem. I spent a couple days thinking I had disproven it, and I thought I came up with a counterexample, and then I realized, oh, wait a minute, my counterexample's wrong, and then I really realized how the proof worked. And so at that point, I understood the proof better than my classmates did, even though, when I told them I had a counterexample, the one guy was like, come on. And he was kind of laughing at me. No, they proved it. You can't have a counterexample. So I'm just saying, because I actually walked around for a few days thinking I had beaten it, and then when I came back, I knew it so much better having gone through that. And then another thing, too, if people know my work with this issue about the government debt and does it burden future generations, I used to think about it a certain way, and then this guy Nick Rowe in Canada got me to realize I was wrong. And then going through that transformation, I feel like I understand it so much better than people who have just always been on one side. So having said all that, yeah, I believe me, if for skeptics who are hearing this interview, I was going to write the book. I thought, so I get people who disagree with it, and it's just, all I can say is now from this perspective, it is so amazing to see these airtight arguments I used to think I had in my toolbox to blow up Christianity. Now I see just how weak they are, and it's amazing. But yet I remember when I thought those things were just, oh man, I got 8 different independent arguments to knock it down. What? So let me get this straight. God was mad at us because we sinned, and he was blaming all of humanity. Then he sends his son, and we murder him, and now God's okay with it? What kind of sick story is that? I had stuff like that in my toolbox, believe me, so I get it.
So after you had this experience, what sort of happened next? I mean, did you start reading books on Christianity? Did you go talk to some people who you knew who were Christians, or did you kind of keep it to yourself and keep studying for a while? What was the process there?
Okay, sure. And so here I might be getting some of these details wrong, so I'm just acknowledging I don't remember this as clearly, and it's too bad. At the time, I thought, oh wow, I should write this down, but I didn't. I was thinking, I'm too busy right now. I'll write it down when I have more time, and then that never happened. So it's too bad I didn't jot this stuff down at least. But so at this point, I wasn't a Christian. I was just I believe in God, and so I started just doing research. I was getting out books on Confucius and Buddhism and all kinds of stuff. I tried going to the Catholic church that was right across the street from where I was, and I'm not trying to offend anybody. I'm just telling you what happened. The first time I went in there, it was like they brought in an outside guy who was trying to raise money for some building project. He wasn't a priest. He was just and his demeanor, I don't know. I don't know. I just walked out. So I stopped going to that particular thing. It wasn't that I renounced Catholicism. I just said, I'm not going to that particular church anymore. So I was looking around, and I was thinking the standard, oh, well, who's to say what particular denominations, right? Or maybe they all are grappling towards or groping for the truth, and God is so, powerful and incomprehensible. It's not surprising there's different schools of thought. But it was just, so it was later, I'm trying to think, it was, I think, a year or two after, what I just described to you guys, that I decided to accept Jesus as my personal Lord and Savior. And that was because, well, not because, but this guy, Dick Clark, I don't know if you guys know it, not the Dick Clark, not the New Year's Eve guy.
Actually, I know who you're talking about. Interestingly enough, I met him out here in Las Vegas 8 years ago at a political event. So I know who you're talking about.
Yeah. So he's a libertarian, for people who are like, what are you talking? Yeah, Dick Clark was out in Vegas. That makes sense. the guy we're talking about, the younger guy, libertarian guy. He had worked at the Mises Institute, and so I just knew him from that. And on his website, I was going there to download his articles on Rothbard or something, and he just had a statement under his bio about the date where he accepted Jesus as personal Lord and Savior. And I was an atheist at the time, and I just thought, oh, that's kind of interesting. So I kind of filed that away. So that's what kind of put it in my head, because I had never gone to evangelical churches or anything. So I didn't even have any frame of reference, but it was from his website that I kind of knew that, oh yeah, there's a certain type of Christian who talks like that, and some of the people, and now that I'm thinking about in college, the ones I tried to talk out of it, I think one guy, his fiance, kind of came at me pretty hard one time when I met him for dinner when I was still an atheist about, do you know the Lord and everything. It really made me uncomfortable at the time. But so anyway, I knew that kind of stuff. So I did that. And that was because just everything I had become a pacifist actually. And what pushed me over the edge there was just reading Jesus, his teachings. And by the way, I'm not saying every Christian needs to be a pacifist. I'm just saying I happened to be one, and it was Jesus' teachings that led me there, because I was doing it, quote, rationally, just thinking through cost benefit and and actually, if I just because I lived in a dangerous neighborhood at this point, I was still in grad school, and I was debating whether to get a gun, and I just decided that no, it's just as a strategy, I'm not going to have one because that will force me to be more careful. You know what I mean? Like I'll have to avoid situations ahead of time. Whereas if I have a gun, I might let things, it's not that I would ever have used a gun in a way that I would have thought was immoral, but it was just, I thought, practically speaking, I think it's a better strategy overall, just if I don't have a gun on me. And so just that kind of logic, but then, reading Jesus stuff and going down that path, turn the other cheek and whatever. When I was younger, I thought that was clearly just hyperbole on his part because, oh my gosh, if you turn the other cheek, people would just, take advantage of you. And then the older I got and thinking through those things and I hope getting wiser more and more, I thought, I think he actually literally meant that. So anyway, that's what made me accept him as my Lord and Savior, because to me, that just meant everything about my life, any, deficiency I have, like who's my role model, with just every problem I have, I just look at, I was like, man, these other libertarians, I'm sitting here trying to help them and they're not following and they don't get it and they're second guessing me. I was so angry at the world at that point still. And so I'd say, well, look at Jesus and how, and his disciple, you know what I mean? Like he didn't get mad at that. So I was just like any kind of problem I had in my life, I realized it was nothing compared to, or I was worried that people weren't accepting I was trying to help them and they didn't appreciate it. Well, Jesus is going around healing people and giving them amazing sermons and they murdered them, so it's just every problem I thought I had, I realized, okay, I really can't complain about that because look at Jesus. So that's what made me do it. At that point, I didn't realize, the problem of sin and that sort of like justification by faith and things. No one had ever explained that to me at that point, but so anyway, I'll stop there. But so that was partly the progression. So at that point, I would have called myself a Christian at that point, but it was more and more thinking more and more like, yeah, maybe these Bible accounts aren't just metaphors or aren't just poetic. Maybe this actually happened. So all this stuff was kind of going on simultaneously. Because the thing I told you originally with the "I forgive you" episode, that just made me not be an atheist anymore. I wasn't a Christian at that point.
So just to give the listeners a sense of where we are, this is the events you're describing right now are in graduate school, or is this after graduate school at this point?
Everything I've said so far, I was still at grad school.
You were still in grad school, okay?
Yeah. So by the time I went and was a professor at Hillsdale College, at that point I was already, a Christian going to church, and in fact I got baptized in a, what I would call a Christian evangelical church in Hillsdale as an adult.
Okay. Yeah. And did you go to Mises U before you were part of it as a professor?
Yes. So
where does that timeline come in? I'm trying to just get a sense of, because I know if nobody knows this particular story of you, they kind of, if they've met you or have listened to a lot of your stuff or seen your writings on Mises.org, then they might have a sense of how far back you go there. So I'm just trying to get the parallel.
Right. So I'm just thinking here. So I was at NYU from 98 to 2003, grad school. And I think my second year there is when I started going to the Mises Institute, first as a grad student, and then later, once I had my PhD as a professor. So yeah, I would have been my first, I think, either 3 or 4 years at the Mises Institute. I was a grad student, like a summer fellow, they called it. So
Okay.
I'd spend the summer down there working on my dissertation.
Gotcha. Okay.
And so whereas maybe halfway through that is when the stuff we've been talking about happened. So I probably, when I first went to Mises U, I was probably an atheist, and then 5 years later, maybe like the fifth time there, I would have not been, something like that.
Were any of the Christians that you interacted with at Mises at the time, whether as students or faculty?
Well, that one guy, Dick Clark, was that, he worked. What did he? I forget. I don't know if he worked in the bookstore or the front. But yeah, so I think he was. I mean, he was young. He was an Auburn student, I believe. I hope I'm not getting my facts mixed up. So yeah, I was just buddies with him, and then he happened to be a Christian. It wasn't like he was proselytizing me, but I knew he was just from his website and whatever. I knew some. I guess if you had asked me, I would have known some of the faculty were, but that's at that point. I mean, that's not how I parse the world, if that makes, you know what I mean? Like it's.
Well, I was just wondering if the people that you were referring to in your story happened to be some of the same people we might have, learned about through the Mises Institute. A lot of our listeners are people who are fans of the Mises Institute. So,
what? Actually,
trying to connect dots a little bit. That's all.
I don't want to say there just because I don't know if they want me talking about, but there was like one young woman who was there who was very Christian, and we had very, pleasant conversations about Thomas Paine and stuff like that, and how, he dedicated the Age of Reason to Washington and stuff like that. So now that you're mentioning it, yeah, it is coming, but just I haven't thought about those years in a while. So at first I was having no recall, but now it's coming back. So yes, I was definitely aware of that milieu, and certainly, I knew that, there's plenty of people in the libertarian Austrian community who are theists of various persuasions.
Yeah, I think that's probably where I was heading with that, or just maybe think of it was, we know a lot of people either at the Mises Institute or supporters or attendees who are Christians. And so it wouldn't be surprising if some of them have had rubbed shoulders with you during that time. So I'm just curious if that was the case. Bob, is there more to the story, or do you feel like we've wrapped that part of it up, or do you have a few more things you want to insert there to bring us to the present?
No, I mean, it just from there, it has just been a gradual process. Been going to church, of course, and Bible study groups when possible. With my cousin, I have a pretty regular Bible study that we go through and read, Matthew Henry and some other commentaries. So it's just frequently I'll stop him and I'll just say it's amazing how compatible the Old and New Testament are. And, like I said, when I was little, and I tried to, when I say little, I mean, I was probably like 12 or 13 or something. And I tried to read the Old Testament at that point, my framework. And it was just, I thought, what the heck is going on? And who is this crazy God of the Old Testament? And so now it is amazing to me just to see, how much foreshadowing there is and so on. But so it's been, to answer your question, it's been a very gradual but hopefully steady process of me just learning more about this stuff.
So, Bob, at the 2016 Christians for Liberty conference, you were the keynote speaker, and your topic, I don't remember the exact title of the talk, but it was something along the lines of arguing from your understanding of theology how Christianity is compatible with not only libertarianism, but specifically Rothbardian anarcho-capitalism. And you go back and forth with different skeptics on your blog, particularly in your Sunday posts and things of that nature. So can you tell us a little bit about what are some of the most common things that people come to you with that are criticisms or counter-arguments or points of contention, and how do you answer them? And I'm speaking specifically in reference to the compatibility of Christianity and libertarianism.
Sure, great question. I think the title of that talk was "Is the God of the Bible a Tyrant?" It was something like that, and I think I got up and said, "No, thank you," or something. It would be funny about opening it.
Yeah, that was the title. I looked it up here.
Yeah, so that on that one, just to give the too long didn't read version. I think was it from Hitchens? I think it was from Hitchens. I was quoting somebody who was making what seemed to be a very compelling case that not only, so the person was arguing, not only do I not believe in the God that, Christians and Jews believe in, but I'm glad he doesn't exist. In other words, it's not like, oh, too bad, that'd be nice, but I don't believe in fairy tales. It's, phew, I'm glad that kind of a monstrous tyrant doesn't exist hanging over, because it is, you can paint it in a certain way, and wait a minute, so there's this invisible thing, this invisible being, and unless I either do everything he says or say I love him more than anybody else, even will be willing to die for him, he's going to burn me forever in eternity. What the heck? That's a messed up system, right? So, and yeah, I could see from that perspective. So what I did in that particular talk that I still haven't seen a good way for Rothbardians to evade this is to say, okay, look, if you don't believe the Bible, if you think it's all just a bunch of fairy tales or whatever, okay, fine. You just don't believe it. Fair enough. But if you're going to go further and say, even on its own terms, why should we respect a being who behaves the way that, the God of the Old Testament does in particular? And so, well, wait a minute. If the Genesis account is true, then God literally created every atom of the material universe. So according to your own views of property rights and, homesteading and everything else, God clearly is the owner of the entire universe. And so he's just the landlord. He can tell you to do whatever he wants. He's the owner. And, like, just take any article Walter Block has ever written that's about, the use of a little plot of land or what somebody can do who owns an airplane, and just say, okay, now what if somebody owned the entire physical universe? And so I was just, saying somewhat tongue-in-cheek that, atheist libertarians are really big on property rights, except when it comes to God. And then all of a sudden, oh, that's not fair. He doesn't have the right to tell us. Well, no, wait a minute. He owns the land you're standing on, wherever you are. So your own system says he has the right to tell you how you can live. So that's perhaps very glib, and people don't like that. But I mean, I think that's a pretty solid starting point. That anything, any rules he gave, because people say things like, oh, that's theocracy of the Old Testament, and they're killing people because they tripped and the ark started to fall. What kind of a monster orders that? Well, again, your own system, if you're a Rothbardian, says, he's the owner. He can lay down whatever rules he wants. If you don't like it, go to a different universe.
So you were taking their something that was pretty non-negotiable to someone like a Rothbardian and pretty solid property rights view, and saying, well, if you just entertain the thought that this God might exist, why is this so abhorrent? Does that make sense?
How could you say that he doesn't have the right to do it? So
right.
You could argue and say you don't like the rules, just like if some landlord, said at 2 a.m. every morning we're going to blast, I don't know, some obnoxious music or something, and that's part of the contract. You as a libertarian could say that seems like a crazy rule, but I guess
right.
If the tenants all knew that going into it, that kind of thing.
Yeah. Do you think that might have helped? I don't know. There's a little bit of me that wonders if that might have made people be like, well, I'm not going to become a Christian if that's the case.
Well, let me say, for sure, I don't think anybody had been an atheist and they heard me say that and then said, oh, okay, now I'm a Christian. I grant you there. I was just trying to show to answer the argument on its own terms of atheist libertarians who don't just say, I can't believe this stuff, guys. Some guy walked on water. Some guy fed 5,000 people. Come on, this is crazy. If that's your view, I get that. And okay, but for the people who go further and say it's not merely that I reject these things as being false historically, but even on its own terms, this God is, why would you worship and love some being that did this kind of stuff? He's a monster. And so, I try to show. And that's just we can keep moving, of course. That wouldn't be the whole thing I would say, but for me, that's the starting point, is to say he certainly has the right to do all this stuff. And now if you want to move the argument and say, well, you just don't like the rules that he has every right to impose, let's talk about that.
Yeah, well, we could make a whole episode out of this particular topic. So we'll go to some other examples.
So another obvious one is Romans 13. That's one that people bring up a lot. So, you go read Romans 13 and gosh, it's plain reading. It certainly looks like it's every statist dream come true. And how could any libertarian possibly endorse a system that includes Romans 13? So here, I'm not saying I have any profound thing that other libertarian Christians haven't brought up already, but say, okay, number one, well, I used this when I was at Hillsdale, and so I gave a talk to a class, and I gave a talk on anarchism, and so the kids at Hillsdale, some of them were very religious, and one of them brought up Romans 13, and I said, okay, but hang on, you guys you're big fans of the Gulf Wars, right? Or not the fans, but you supported the U.S. government's efforts against Saddam Hussein, and of course they did. Hillsdale was very pro, U.S. military, and we're going to bring freedom to these people, kind of thing. And Saddam's a tyrant. And so I said, well, wait a minute. Doesn't Romans 13 say if Saddam gassed some people, they must have had it coming? I mean, God didn't put Saddam in power for no reason, right? And so it was showing they clearly don't believe that for any ruler at all. They had their views as to what was just and unjust government. And so I said, same thing, that clearly Paul can't be, it doesn't make sense to be interpreting him as giving a blanket endorsement of every possible political figure. I mean, Paul himself was in jail, and clearly there were, heroes of the Bible who were, stood up to the state and were killed for it. So I said it obviously can only mean, either Paul speaking nonsense, or he means that, if the political authorities are executing lawful commands or decrees, then, if you get in the way of that and you get on the wrong side of the law, then, well, that's because you're a lawbreaker. So it's just, if I as a Rothbardian just disagree with you about what the proper role of the state should be. You think as long as it obeys the Constitution, then it's okay. I think no, even there it's illegitimate. So, but we're not. Both of us agree. We can imagine political rulers doing things that clearly can't be the type of thing Paul had in mind when he wrote Romans 13.
Right. You can't hold up Romans 13 at the gates of Auschwitz and be like, see, the Bible endorses this kind of behavior because Romans 13, it just doesn't work.
Yeah, and I should say too, I think some atheists will call my bluff and say, well, right, you kind of admitted, Murphy, either Paul's speaking nonsense or this is what he means. Well, we're saying just plain text reading of it, straightforward reading, he's speaking nonsense. So if someone wants to go down that path, fair enough. But like I say, I was arguing with minarchist Christians at Hillsdale. And so I was saying, you guys can't use minarchist Christians who had been supporters of the Gulf Wars. And I was like, there's no way you guys can use Romans 13 against me because, so I'm not saying that there could be internally consistent atheist libertarians using Romans 13. I think they could just say, yeah, these people speak nonsense. And what are you talking about?
What else do you tend to come across with your atheist anarchist friends?
Let's see. Well, maybe the story of Abraham and Isaac, that, geez, what kind of a crazy, monstrous God tells a guy to kill his son just to prove he loves him, or, ugh. Like, if any human person, any human king did that, that'd be disgusting. So for there, I mean, I guess with all this stuff too, I get now like the term apologist, because normally that has a bad connotation. Like if I say Krugman's an apologist for Obamacare, what I mean is, oh, Mike Krugman knows he wants to support it and he's coming up with all sorts of desperate measures. So at first I used to think that was a weird term for Christians to be using, like this, oh, C.S. Lewis is an apologist, and like, yeah, do we want to talk like that? Doesn't that? But I mean, let me just admit that here, that yes, it's because I had my experience and I am now, a committed Christian, and just because I've studied other aspects of it and things have clicked with the Bible with me that before I also would have either found incomprehensible or repugnant, and now I say, oh no, now I see what's going on there, and I've had experiences similar to the more trivial things where, oh, I didn't used to understand Arrow's theorem, and whoa, now I get it, and I understand it so much better because I realize how blind I was. A similar thing happens here. So stuff that, again, when I was younger, yeah, I would have understood that criticism. So now, but given that I trust, I know I'm jumping around, but I will come back to it. Let me say though that when Jesus, clearly, he is a more moral person than I am. right? If you don't believe in him historically, okay, well, the character depicted in the gospel accounts, say what you will about him, but he is not some moral lightweight. And he says there's no one good but God, and he's obviously been steeped in the Hebrew scriptures, so he's referring to what we call the God of the Old Testament when he says the God of Abraham. So what I'm saying is, if that guy who says, let him who is without sin cast the first stone, if that guy who's getting nailed to a cross and says, forgive them, Father, for they know not what they do, if he is telling me, in his opinion, the only good being around is God, then I can't sit there and say, oh, well, he told Abraham to kill Isaac, and so therefore, he must be a tyrant. So that's where I'm coming from with the area, issue of humility and so on. That if it looks like God in the Old Testament is doing something that, geez, I don't get that at all. You really got to be careful before you just dismiss it and say, well, I must be a more moral being than God is. Like, that's just hubris. So anyway, back to the story. So number one, obviously, he stops him. He doesn't actually have him kill his son. Number two, who does let his son be killed for others is God lets his son be killed for us. So that's kind of an interesting twist that, I think it just foreshadows and shows, God, yes, in principle, we should be willing to give up our most valuable thing, even our son, our cherished son, in the service of God. He wouldn't actually ask that of you, even though he's willing to do that sacrifice for us. But also something I had just more recently occurred to me, if you're trying to, he's got to be the patriarch, and it's got to go down through his line, for the prophecy to come true. So imagine you're his son and you're getting tied up and whatever. Like, you realize, whoa, my dad really believes this. When he's telling me that God told him to do whatever, like, that's gonna. You know what I mean? Like, just like if you're a little kid and your parents don't let you skip church and, wow, my parents really tithe and okay, and this and that, whereas if your parents just, they go to church when it's convenient and so on, you would have different experiences growing up. So that was something that, even though it freaks us out as modern people, but, that certainly would be a good way of Abraham showing, like, I really, I believe this stuff. This is just some show I'm putting on. So, I know this won't convince anybody to say, yep, those people are crazy. But if you had other reasons to believe that, you can see how that story does fit in with the whole narrative.
One of the things that you're doing here with just, obviously a very small sampling of examples from Scripture, Romans 13, Abraham and Isaac. What you're giving is a way to look at the Scripture by saying, well, let's just take it on its own terms and think through it and apply a little bit of logic and goodwill, especially for those of you who might be listening who are kind of like, yeah, right, I can't believe that, to kind of operate under the assumption that, well, let's just see how this would all fit together, because it doesn't. A lot of times, use the word paradigm shift. A lot of times there is a sense in which something doesn't make sense because we just don't think that way. Even earlier I asked a question and you were kind of like, I don't parse the world that way. Well, it's just the way your brain's wired. Mine's thinks a little bit differently. And so sometimes you have to get in the mind of the narrators of the Scripture, or, sometimes I say this with trepidation a little bit, then inside the mind of God, and like, okay, well, this whole thing plays out in a certain way and there's certain parallels and things like that. So, what I think you're giving us is a few examples of how to think through, I would say, controversial passages. And, it's also, some of the ways that you've described it, I've never thought of. And, I think that would be acceptable way to look at, explaining these things, especially if you have for those of us who sometimes have a hard time explaining to people who just kind of like, yeah, I just don't buy it. So, I think those are really helpful.
Well, thanks. And I guess one I just did recently is, just the notion of hell. And people have a hard time with that. And wait a minute, so I don't live up to God's rules, or I don't accept his son as my savior, or I don't love him, and what the heck? If I don't do that, then I'm going to burn forever. Like, how can that be punishment that fits the crime? That just offends everything. So there, and the way I tried to explain that was more from a psychological perspective, and just I'll give the quick version, is just to say, okay, let me just, what if it were something like this, and then supposing what I'm about to say actually kind of captures what happens, and then can you see how the biblical warnings and so on would make more sense in that light? And I said, so let's say there's an afterlife, right? That's kind of got to be true, otherwise none of this stuff matters. And then what if what happens when you die is you come face to face with God, you're in direct communion with him, and he lets you just become instantly aware and have full comprehension of all of human history, up, from the beginning up until when you died, and then even beyond that. And suppose now with that full information, you realize, you see how much worse of a person you were than you thought you had been in your life. And so where I'm coming from is when I had my little epiphany, and I realized, like, looking back, like, oh, gee, a lot of situations where I thought I was completely in the right and I was the aggrieved party. And then I was like, ooh, you know what? Actually, from their point of view, I did such and such, and ooh. So what if it's like that, but, times a billion, because you're seeing the full ram? Because there's all kinds of stuff that you probably do to people that you don't know. Like you hurt someone's feelings where they go, or you yell at a coworker and that guy goes home and yells at his kid. And then that kid grows up in that environment. I'm just giving examples of the kind of thing I mean, but I think if you fully saw just how bad you were, and you could say it'd be the other way too, that, oh, wow, I helped that person, or I held the door for that old guy when he was coming out of the store, and that really brightened his day, and I didn't even know that. Yes, but I mean, it's not like if you look at a serial killer's life and you're like, oh, well, let's look at all the good stuff he did too. No, I mean, you do certain things that are really over some line in your head. That's it, that you can't make up for that by doing good stuff to other people. And so I'm saying, what if when you die, you realize you crossed the line in your head? As you draw the line, it's not that God's imposing his rules on you. You see, according to your own value system, how horrible you've been, and you had no idea that realization, if you weren't ready for that could be hell. And you're just like that now, stunned and furious at the world, and oh, it's not my fault. I didn't realize. Why didn't you tell me? And I wish I'd never been born. You could imagine the reaction if that's really what it were like. And so I'm saying, if that's the kind of thing, well, what would prepare you for that? Well, Christianity would. If you really intellectually, emotionally, psychologically have been preparing yourself by every time you go to church, you say things and you read prayers, or you say prayers and you read scriptures and whatever, saying you deserve hell except for Jesus standing in your place, then you're going to be equipped to see, like, ooh, yeah, you're filling in the details here, God. Okay, yes, I see. Ugh. Yep. And then on top of that, if it all works together, you would see why did he design the world that way? And you see not only all the bad things you did, but how he orchestrated everything to come together such that you and all the billions of other people doing bad things, nonetheless, good ends up triumphing in the end. And you're just in awe at, like, whoa, that was a pretty cool story you just told. And so if you're in that view, and then you end up, instead of concentrating on your weaknesses and failings, you're just in awe of, how did you pull that out? That's amazing. The intellect and the mercy. And of course, a key component of that is he was willing to come as a man and let himself be killed. And that was a crucial part of the story to make it all fit. So, those are two routes you could take. You could just sit there, be horrified and furious and full of shame about your own weaknesses, or you could have kind of known that going into it. And now you're just sitting there impressed to see how does it all fit together. And, oh, okay, that's why those bad things had to happen, because now I see it as part, like little cogs in the whole big story of the triumph of good over evil, and this is amazing, and how love is more powerful than hate, and wow, this is amazing, and that's the difference between heaven and hell. So if it's something like that, obviously I'm just speculating here, but suppose it were something in the ballpark of what I just said, and then the Christian story or Christian worldview makes a lot more sense, telling you that, no, you deserve hell, and if you don't get a savior, you're not going to like the judgment, where it's not God imposing what you think are arbitrary. It's not like, oh, what, I'm not supposed to eat pork or something, give me a break. No, it's, you're going to see the suffering you caused people that you didn't realize. In your own value system, you're going to be, have guilt.
Right. So one of the things that is the word that comes to mind, I should say, in talking about and hearing what you just said, and also with reference to your realization that the way that you looked at the world, is the word awakening. And it sounds like, the way you would view this is, you could wake up now to the reality of your existence before it's too late. Or you can be frustrated after it's too late. Would that be fair? I mean, you've used that several times. It's like looking back at, or just seeing the world as it really is, rather than as the way you thought it was.
Yes, I like that a lot. And also, just to give more of the story that's relevant to what you just asked. So at the time, when I had that, I'm calling it an epiphany, you could call it awakening. What I did the next few days is I was going around apologizing to people, like the ones I could still, either in my direct day-to-day life at grad school, or I was even remembering people from years ago, and I was trying to find them on Facebook and stuff to apologize to them, like to say, So anyway, so yes, if just in my own little thing there, and all of a sudden I was filled with remorse and went and tried to fix it as best I could. Yeah, you can imagine, suppose that's what happens in the afterlife, is you realize just how much damage you inflicted, and then it's too late to do anything about it at that point because you're dead, or you're not on Earth anymore. So, and maybe that's what hell would be, is if it was so unbearable that you couldn't stand how awful you had been, again, according to your own value system. So yeah, to be enlightened and come face to face with the truth. And that's also where, I think Christian humility comes in, that, you really don't want to go through this world thinking you're so much better than those people over there, because you're not. And if that's what you're thinking and that's how you're basing your self-worth on, you're just setting yourself up for catastrophe if what I said is remotely true as to what's going to happen after you die.
Well, Bob, you've certainly given us a lot to think about in different ways. We've had guests on this show to tackle the topic of divine violence, and even, I think, on the topic of hell that we've touched on. And so, we have a variety of beliefs in the Christian spectrum, as you probably know. And I think one more way to look at it is what you've provided us here. So, I really like the way that your testimony basically is very self-reflective in a lot of ways, that you go back and try to reconcile. You weren't just somebody who moved on and said, oh, well, okay, I was wrong, and I'm not going to deal with the fact that, I hurt other people and things like that. And that you seem to have this humble way of expecting or examining your life and expecting that, you might be wrong and that you can be changed. And I think, I think that's what happens as you grow. I don't want to say grow older. I'm learning that that's part of Christian and adult maturity, is to realize that that's just what Christian, I guess we call it discipleship as Christians, is that we realize that we're growing. So yeah, thank you very much for being here to tell us about this.
Well, I appreciate it, and let me just because you brought it up again, let me stress. It may have seemed silly, and people might have been wondering, like, why is he talking about Arrow's impossibility theorem and the government debt debate? Because those just were two things where, like I said, I was really sure I was right on those things, especially the government debate one. Like, I even had it in one of my books that I had written, the view that I now think is a little bit erroneous and certainly incomplete. And so if you've never had that in your life where you were so sure about something and then had it flip on you, I would humbly say, do you really think you're basically right about everything up till now? I mean, and so if you haven't had that experience, because I think a lot of people, when they're so sure about religion, one way or the other, I kind of just think, well, have you ever had a real big overturning of an important view in your opinion, or in your intellectual superstructure? And so if not, I wonder, does that mean that you would never go there, or you would never examine your own beliefs enough to really? So here, I'm not talking about theology. I'm saying even something more mundane, something related to your political views or something you do at work, what have you. But if you've never had like a major thing where you realized, wow, I was vehemently on the other side and thought the people disagreeing with me were crazy, and now I see this flaw in my reasoning and why they were actually right all along, and to see how blind you were because they were saying true statements and you just kept dismissing them all along in that argument. So if you've never experienced that, I think you're missing out, because I think that actually helped me. I think the fact that I had those experiences made it possible for me to have that epiphany and realize, whoa, I have been totally mischaracterizing all these social interactions over the last decade plus. And so without that prior experience on some sort of, trivial intellectual thing, I don't think just my psyche could have handled it.
Well, Bob, I think if there's any impression that I want to have on this show is that we can be wrong and it's okay to move on. So I'm glad someone as authoritative in the libertarian community is saying what you just said, and I think that's perfect to end on. So thanks again and for being here.
Great. Thanks for having me, guys.
Thank you for joining us for another episode of the Libertarian Christian Podcast. If you'd like to reach out to us, you can email us at podcast@libertarianchristians.com. You can reach us on Facebook, Twitter, and of course our website, libertarianchristians.com. We are a 501c3 organization, and we depend on your generous donations, and you can go to libertarianchristians.com/donate to support us. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.
The Libertarian Christian Podcast is a project of the Libertarian Christian Institute, a registered 501c3 nonprofit. The audio engineers were Doug Stewart and Jason Rink, and voiceovers were by Matthew Bellis and Caitlin Horn. If you'd like to find out more about the LCI, please visit us on the web at www.libertarianchristians.com.